We just love to hear. I had the privilege to pop into a couple different groups and heard some really interesting philosophical inquiry. Anything anyone would like to share out that came up for you in your group, or that's just like a question on your mind heading into our session with Lucy and really thinking about criminal justice?
Not necessarily a question
Or
referring to
thoughts,
what we're thinking
reflections?
about. Actually, so I've noticed that the speakers have been being recorded. Is there somewhere where we can go to access those recordings?
Great question. Yes, I have been very remiss in getting them onto our website. They are on our YouTube station, but I will be putting them into our website. So if there's anything, and also if there's anyone in particular that you would like, I can send that to you from the YouTube. But yes, like we do that for folks who aren't able to make it, and there's just so much richness, and also there's a lot to take in. So going back and rewatching can help.
Okay, thank you.
Um, any questions about criminal justice on your mind? Just like thoughts that are rumbling around, something that you heard from someone else, something in the reading, something that you're particularly eager to engage with Lucy about. Much like our session last time with Stephanie Young, the lead fellows developed questions that they're going to be posing to Lucy. You can also put things in the chat that Lucy will try to address. But there's so much when we think about criminal justice that we just want to sort of have that surfaced.
I accidentally left the meeting, but just came back. But something that my group brought up that I thought was kind of interesting, and I don't even know if Lucy could even answer this, but just the idea that is there ever really going to be criminal justice? Like, is complete and just full criminal justice? Is that ever going to happen? Because we all have so many generational biases and opinions, and the reality is like, is that ever going to be achieved? Is that even a possibility? So I thought that was something that was kind of interesting, and is definitely on my mind.
I think that's a really great question, Eloise. And I think if when Lucy is here, what she would ask you is, what does that mean to you? Like, what would criminal justice mean? And I think that that's something that all of us should be thinking about. What would absolute criminal justice look like as a framing question for us to have today? So that's a great one to put on the table. Anyone else want to raise like overarching questions like that on your mind?
I think one thing that came up in my group is we spoke about the question that sort of had two parts. One was, why is the criminal justice system the way it is today? And the second part was, how can we improve it? And I think that's sort of the big question of the day that is not super easy to answer. But I would be curious to hear what Lucy has to say about what sort of historical factors have led us to the state of the criminal justice system right now, and why is it that we see so many disparities and so many issues, and sort of how have those come to be, and then what can we do to fix those, which is a huge question. But
Yes.
I'm interested.
Well, but the good
engage
news
with that.
is, yeah, the good news is that Lucy has spent her life and career thinking about, those very things, and can hopefully give us a little truncated. I think we all know that originally, like policing, originated in penal colonies and sort of around the slave trade. And there are lines that you can trace through that. But I think she can give us a fuller history. So I think that is a great question to pose. Any others on your mind? Again, this is a pretty primo opportunity to ask, one of the world's foremost criminal justice experts. So we want to make sure that we get all the good questions in.
Sorry,
Oh.
really quick. The first question my group discussed, we didn't discuss a lot of time just because the discussion naturally flowed into our second question. But the first one we had was, do you think the criminal justice system can be both effective and fair? And the reason why I think about that in the terms of Lucy Lang and her career is because I know district attorneys or assistant district attorneys, from what from my understanding, the main goal is to protect the community. And what's it called? A lot of the time, the individual who is trying to be charged does not end up going to jail for their crimes. And some people, I guess, might not see that as fair, but the job as the prosecutor and the district attorney is kind of, they lean more towards the person who committed the crime. So thinking about that in that context, I just wonder how, from a district attorney's perspective, the criminal justice system is both effective and fair.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And did your group define what you mean by effective and fair? And I would welcome people to put into the chat, what does effective and fair mean to you, when it comes to the criminal justice system? Because I think defining these terms is really critical. And also, are we saying effective and fair for someone who has had a crime perpetrated against them, for someone who has perpetrated a crime, for someone who is a prosecutor, for someone who is a defender? How do we think about all of the stakeholders and how they are affected within the system? I want to give a little bit of framing, and please feel free to keep, putting questions in the chat. But you probably read, we have some challenges around how do we capture like the reality of what's happening in our country. From what we've read, from what we shared in the background readings, overall violent crime was up by about 3% in 2020 over the previous year. You've probably heard things about 2020 being or 2021 being particularly violent years with an uptick in crime. And one thing that's important to understand is that this should be seen in the context of a longer term downward trend from a peak in the early 1990s. So across the United States in 2020, there were 25% more murders recorded than in the previous year. Overall, the police arrest someone every 3 seconds in the US. Take a moment to think about that. Every 3 seconds, someone is arrested. More than 80% of arrests nationally are for low-level nonviolent offenses. The cost of policing, in our country is $115 billion per year. In New York City, we spend, to be specific, $11,036,298,140 on police. It is 8% of our city budget, which translates to about $626 per resident. That is the most by far of any other city spent in policing in absolute dollars. We spend $500,000 per prisoner in Rikers each year, and 16 people died there last year. Over 50% of people are in prison for violent crimes, and that is something that often isn't seen, and there is some confusion about it. 90% of prisoners are in local prisons. Just 10% are in federal prisons. And this is something that's important to understand because you've probably read about, drug crimes, and if you're familiar with Michelle Alexander's work or Ava DuVernay, the statistics that are often there. Has someone, let me see if I can do it. People. Okay, thank you very much. So, sorry, as I was saying, one of the reasons about drug crimes is that in federal prisons, which has just 10% of the overall prisoners, but within federal prisons, 50% are there for drug crimes. So when you hear about sort of those high numbers, it is a percentage of a relatively low percentage of the overall prison population. And why that's important to know is that even if we were to release all the people on drug crimes, and we've been doing more and more of that, it would only lead to a small reduction in those who are incarcerated. So, one of the overarching questions for today are really, what are the better ways to, or what are the best ways to ensure public safety while putting more justice into criminal justice? Because these issues are playing out, in great tension today. We have a new mayor as of a week ago. I think I included in our materials that just on Friday, the new head of the police put out a memo of concern about policies of our incoming incoming Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, about, more progressive policies. So we already sort of see brewing a little bit of a face-off in, in perceptions of what we want the vision for our city to be. So Lucy has joined us now, and we truly could have no finer person with us to sort of help us understand, where we are and the possibilities for where we're heading. There you are, Lucy. Welcome, welcome. We've just been having a little bit of conversation before your arrival, and we're going to pose some questions to you, but just wanted to share a little bit of what came up in our debrief. We started with some philosophical inquiry into criminal justice in small groups. And Eloise raised a really eloquent question about, will there ever be criminal justice? And we started to talk about, what that is. And Malcolm raised a question of, why is the system how it is, and how can we improve it? I said, these are the guiding questions throughout your life and career. And Jelena raised the question of, can the system be both effective and fair? And we talked about, what that would mean and how to do that for stakeholders. So I will put those questions, in the ether as we come to you, just for a brief introduction about, what brings you to this space. And then we're going to pose a series of questions to you for the next 45 minutes or so. 40 minutes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me. I apologize that I'm a little bit delayed, and also apologize for the background noise. This is a function of being a working parent, running around trying to fit a million things in. So thanks for your patience. So I served as an assistant district attorney here in Manhattan for many years. I handled the most serious violent crimes, including murders and domestic violence. And then I went on to run a small nonprofit working with district attorneys around the country on issues related to criminal justice reform. In March, I ran in the primary for district attorney and did not prevail, but I am friends with the current district attorney, and I'm certainly rooting for every success for that office. And I'm honored to now be serving as New York State's 11th Inspector General. The Inspector General oversees fraud, corruption, and abuse in all state executive agencies. And you may be familiar with the drama that has roiled the state under the prior governor, who appointed the heads of all of the state agencies. And so there's a lot of exciting work to be done with respect to fraud and corruption, including that we have jurisdiction over the Department of Corrections and in fact do a great deal of investigation. And that is, I would say, the area in which my current work most closely intersects with issues of criminal justice reform. So I'm really excited to be with you all today. I admire the work that you're doing as youth in our city and for our city now, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Fantastic. And thank you again, Lucy, for making the time for this. Lucy has had quite a week, as we shared, and issued a major report about some drug crime or drug detection violations. She's not taking it easy as she comes in. She's really doing some incredible work, and we'll hear more about that today. Trinity, would you like to ask our first question?
Yes, so my first question is, could you tell us what drew you to devote your career to criminal justice?
So Trinity,
as we do that, as each person asks their question, just so Lucy can sort of identify you, Trinity, if you want to tell us sort of who you are, what grade you're in, and what school, that'll help Lucy put a face to the work.
Yes, so I'm Trinity. I'm currently 18 years old, and I reside in Maryland.
Wonderful. I'm very glad to meet you, Trinity. Sorry, one moment. Yes, that is my 6-year-old, who's very opinionated, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more from her in the course of our conversation. I think there are a lot of different things that led me to pursue my career to date, but one that really comes to mind right now is that my mom was student teaching at a New York City public school when I was about 3 or 4 years, I must have been 4 years old. And I went to school with her, and because my daycare was closed for whatever reason for the day. And I was supposed to just sort of sit in the back of the classroom and play with my stuff or whatever. But I happened to overhear, I noticed that there was a kid with his head on his desk in the front of the classroom asleep. And I overheard my mother ask the primary teacher, why is he sleeping? Should I wake him up? And the teacher said, I just let him sleep because I never know what last night was like for him. And it was a very early introduction to the idea that there were kids in my own neighborhood whose lives at home might be very different from my own. And it really stayed with me and has been part of why I chose to pursue a career that's committed to making sure that everyone is safe and secure at home and elsewhere.
Very, very powerful. Thank you for grounding us. Amelie, will you ask our next question and introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Amelie. I'm a current junior at Spence and I'm 16. My question is kind of relating to like the philosophical aspect, like how should we think about crime as kind of like a whole? And kind of like, is it going up or down and what are the drivers of it?
There are so many questions embedded in that really important question, Amelie. Thank you for raising it. You know, one of the interesting issues is the lexicon, the way that we talk about criminal justice. And in fact, there's a movement, you may be familiar with this or have read about it, but there's a movement among scholars and advocates to stop using the term criminal justice, that it should be the criminal legal system, because as the saying goes, there's no justice in this system. Now, I come down on the side of preserving the use of criminal justice because I think it's aspirational and that we should want there to be justice in the system, that is, and that naming it that is one indicator of encouraging us to move in that direction. But I also think that it gets to a really important response to your question, which is the lack of justice, the lack of equitable administration of the legal system across demographics and across jurisdictions. And you know, the crime is up now from where it was 2-3 years ago at this time, but compared to what it was like even when I was a kid in New York City, it is significantly down. So you have to look at these things in terms of long-term trends, but also not to lose sight of the individual impact of every single case. I worked under the legendary district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, who used to say, every case is important to the victim. And I've held that very close to my heart in the course of my career and tried to take every case very seriously, precisely because there's a victim to whom it matters. And victims often think that if one of their family members is seriously hurt or even killed, and there's not a long prison sentence, that it somehow minimizes their family member, their loss. And changing that paradigm is part of what has to happen in order to move this movement forward. I think that we're really between two paradigms right now. The criminal legal system, such as it is, and the Department of Corrections, they're built on a punitive model. And we are increasingly, as a society, moving towards a framework that is not punitive, that's more restorative, that's more rehabilitative, that's more holistic, that thinks about the causes of crime. And the growing pains are severe because we're stuck with this sprawling set of bureaucracies that were built essentially to punish and shame people. And every small development we make towards having a more restorative system is butting up against these existing systems that were designed for totally different purposes.
I think Malcolm's question is going to lean in a little bit more to that tension that you've surfaced so powerfully, Lucy. Malcolm, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. I'll first say my name is Malcolm Jr. From Manhattan. So the next question sort of has two parts. First is, how can we ensure safety, but also address the consequences of crime and deal with the perpetrators of crime and respecting them as well?
I'm sorry, Malcolm, you just cut out at the beginning of the first sentence. Can you just repeat the beginning of the question again for me?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, how can we ensure public safety, but also address the consequences of crime and also the people who commit those crimes?
Yeah, well, it is important to note that not everyone means the same thing when we talk about public safety. Measuring simply the number of burglaries, robberies, murders is one measure. And often that's the measure that, say, the police use. But when you think about what makes people really safe, you know, being well fed, being housed, those kinds of things really are important factors that also contribute to whether people feel safe and secure. And I would advocate for kind of a broader range of thinking about what constitutes public safety and expanding beyond the traditional indicia, which are just what are known as those sort of index crimes. You know, I've often thought that the way that we measure success as prosecutors, you know, would be by the number of cases processed or by the number of people who come through the system is flawed, and that we should really measure it based on the number of people who are successful after they interact with the system. You know, if someone goes to prison, gets out, and then ends up living their life in despair, that's not a win for the system, right? We want to equip people to succeed afterwards. So I think we need to expand the way we think about public safety. And then the way to sort of set folks up to succeed is to think about wraparound services rather than punitive responses, to think about the causes of crime. When people commit crime out of desperation, that addressing the causes of that desperation is far more likely to have a positive long-term effect on public safety than simply removing someone for a limited period of time, subjecting them to inhumane conditions and returning them back to their existing community that gave rise to those underlying conditions to begin with, and asking them to do things differently in the future. So it really is, we're at a very, really critical moment. I mean, the city that we're going to be leaving to all of you, it can be drastically different, but it's going to require a lot of work from all of you to help us get there.
Yes, we are. Very critical moment in time. Cleo, would you like to pose your question to Lucy?
Yes. So, hi, I'm Clea, and I'm a junior at Eleanor Roosevelt High School. And my question is, since becoming New York State Inspector General, how has your perception of the criminal justice system changed now that you've had the opportunity to go behind the scenes and see things differently from the rest of us?
And Lucy, if you want to answer that, I know you've only been in your role for a couple of weeks, so it can also be, you know, the various roles that you've held, you know, within the criminal legal system and how that's impacted your perceptions.
You know, look, from a career standpoint, I think that having, in some ways, this job is not that different from the job that I saw. I mean, I'm not handling day-to-day crimes in Manhattan, but I'm handling crimes and wrongdoing that happen by people who work for the state across the state all the time. And so I actually feel kind of well equipped in that sense to do what I'm doing now. But it's also learning. I mean, I oversee over 100 state agencies, and they all have acronyms like OTDA and ACA and blah, 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 blah. And honestly, I don't know what most of the acronyms mean yet. And so there's a huge kind of learning curve to just adapting to a new ecosystem, because my work has always been here in the city. So learning the state system and the players in the state system has been a whole piece of the puzzle that is a challenge that is sort of has nothing to do in a way with the substance of the work. So I guess I would encourage folks who are thinking about careers in the public sector to think about your skill sets and find places that you can leverage them. And then you kind of don't take no for an answer, right? I didn't get the opportunity to serve in the way that I thought I was best suited to serve, but then another opportunity came along to use those skills to further the same interests. And I didn't mention in my introduction, but you may have seen in some materials that I created a college and prison program when I was an assistant DA that's now really a national model. And I think that work has uniquely well equipped me to be able to go on to.
I think you're still on mute, Lucy.
Sorry, many moving pieces. I think that it really well equipped me to be able to do exactly this work, specifically in working with the Department of Corrections.
Thank you for that. And we are going to go to Ishal.
Hi, I'm Ishal, and I'm also a junior. And the question that I wanted to ask—
California.
Yeah. And the question that I wanted to ask is, what do you recommend as the best way to get accurate information about crime and what's really happening?
One wild thing is that even people who work directly in the system don't always have accurate information about crime. So you may be familiar with the NYPD's development of the CompStat methodology, which is tracking of crimes and arrests, and kind of comparing the two and holding people locally who work in particular precincts accountable, holding the police officers accountable for the numbers. Now, there are imperfections in that system, but that has only been in practice for the past decade and a half or so. And honestly, as I've worked with DAs around the country, including a lot in California, many of them are actually only now beginning to really use data to help drive the way they allocate resources. So the district attorneys, for example, generally speaking, accept cases that come in from the police department. So someone gets arrested or someone gets shot, and the police department will bring the case to the DA, and the DA then makes the charging decisions and handles the legal component of things. Now, starting really in the early aughts, Manhattan DA's office started to kind of lead the charge on identifying areas of biggest intake and then diverting resources directly to those. So instead of saying, we're going to treat every robbery equally, we would say we're going to really double down because there have been an increased number of robberies on the Lower East Side. And we're going to try to then invest and encourage the police department to get more undercover officers out on the street in that neighborhood to help try to prevent some of the commission of that crime. We're going to partner with community-based organizations to make sure that they have the resources to give kids opportunities after school in areas where we think that there's extremely high crime. So data is really evolving in terms of how it's used in the criminal justice system, and it's not all to the good. I think that there's a legitimate concern about privacy and about corruption in use of, or about using data to justify excessively surveilling particular communities. So all of the ways in which we use data have to be scrutinized in order to make sure that it's being done in a way that is equitable and that it's consistent with the other long-term goals of the system.
Lots to think about there. Matthew.
Hello, Lucy. I would like to thank you again for joining us, considering you're a 6-year-old having a nice time. I'm Matthew. I'm a senior from New Jersey. And so my question kind of builds upon the last question about the data and collecting data in criminal justice and how currently there are some inadequacies about collecting data. So my question is, how would you like to see criminal justice data systems be improved in both New York and on a national level?
Well, one of the biggest challenges to data is that many courthouses and many lawyers who work in those systems and police departments as well are still on kind of a paper-based practice. So at the Manhattan DA's office, I was a part of the move from keeping paper case files to keeping our files electronically. And it's not perfect. I mean, there are a lot of lawyers who are used to handwriting their notes, and obviously you can handwrite your notes and upload them, but you're asking people who've been doing their work the same way for 20 years to do something very, very different. Now, there's, of course, a whole new breed of young lawyers, analysts, paralegals, who are totally comfortable in doing all digital work. And so I think we're going to see that change over the course of the next generation. But the threshold question really is, how are we getting the data? And we're only as good as the people who are inputting data. And that is an area where there's still huge challenges. I worked with the district attorney of Albuquerque when he took office 3 years ago or so. And he came into an office that had just thousands and thousands of boxes in case files. You know, they couldn't search to see if they wanted to know how many people were arrested for marijuana in, 2012 or whatever. They couldn't search for it because it was in physical case files. And so automating that going forward, but also trying to scan and make searchable all that historical data was a huge effort on the part of that office. Now, recently in Manhattan, we were, I think, right behind Chicago in creating a public-facing data portal that is available through the website, where you can search for kinds of crime and cross-reference it with demographic data to determine whether or not people are being treated the same cross race, et cetera, the same cross neighborhoods based on the same crimes. And I think that's kind of the future of data, that we're going to see an increasing amount of transparency. But again, there's I think, very real concern that privacy advocates have about, even when you anonymize data in an island as small as Manhattan, when you start publishing about number of arrests in a particular neighborhood, it can be pretty easy, even if things are anonymous, to identify people. So that's a countervailing concern that is very much top of mind as we move into an increased era of publicly available criminal justice data.
Yeah, tensions and trade-offs, always something to keep at the forefront. Sneha, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, I'm Sneha, and I'm from Texas. So I noticed that crime seems to concentrate in some areas, for example, like the Bronx. Why do you think that happens, and what would you really do about it?
This harkens back to one of the earlier questions. The drivers of crime tend to be poverty, absence of opportunity, sometimes hunger, where people make not necessarily entirely rational calculations, but we do often see that there's increased crime in neighborhoods where there are decreased resources. There are great studies that show things like there are crime trends align with areas that are food deserts, where people don't have access to healthy eating options. So much of the reason that we see crime in particular neighborhoods is because of the absence of other services.
Great. We're going to hop down to Sharona. Sharona, birthday girl Sharona, would you like to ask your question? It is Sharona's 18th birthday, Lucy, and Sharona has been
Wow, welcome to the Voters Club.
Thank you. Well, hi, I'm Sharona. I'm a senior at the Scholars Academy, and the question I have is, do you think that prisons should focus more on rehabilitation and re-education instead of punishment? And what's the best way to engage with opposition to this?
Happy birthday, Sharona. I do think that prisons should focus on rehabilitation, and I think that we are a long way from getting there as a culture. If you look at prison models in Norway and in Germany, where people are given more liberty when they're confined, where people live in more of a college-like environment instead of in barred doors, that the outcomes tend to be much better when people are released. They're much more able to reintegrate when they're sent home. So I think that that's the direction that we want to be moving as a country. I think the best way to talk about it and to counter opposition to it is through exposure. Glenn Martin, who is an advocate here in the city for prison reform, and formerly incarcerated himself, has said that I'm going to forget the I forget the exact thing, but it was something to the effect of people closest to the problem or closest to the solution, kind of along the lines of a lot of Brian Stevenson's work around proximity. And I found that when I brought assistant district attorneys inside New York State prisons, that it really changed their view of how the system should be punitive. That once people go inside prisons and see how poorly people are often treated and see how dehumanizing it is, and also see how human the people behind bars are, that really, really changes hearts and minds in terms of people's commitment to the prevailing punitive system.
That is a good segue. Carly, we're going to come to you for our next question.
Hi, Lucy. I'm Carly, as you know. I'm 18 and I live in New York City. And my question is, what do you think the goals of an effective criminal justice system should be? And to reduce crime, is it to punish people who break the law, or is it something else altogether?
Hi, Carly. I'm so happy to see you. I think that really the goal of the criminal justice system, and this is going to sound very naive in a way, should be to put itself out of business. I mean, what we ideally want is a world where that we don't need a criminal justice system. We want a world where people cooperate and don't hurt one another and respect each other's property rights and that kind of thing. So I think that the idea of shrinking the system is really a good one. But it has to be done very thoughtfully, because especially at a moment like this where crime is increasing and there's so much negative reaction to reforms, that I don't think it's the moment to start pulling out resources. It's really a moment to double down resources on productive alternatives. So I would say that the goal should be to build a system that enables everyone to thrive. And a lot of that is returning power back to communities instead of power to large-scale state systems.
Powerful. Emma, coming to you for the next.
Hi, I'm Emma, and I'm a senior at Fieldson in New York City. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And my question is, how can and should the United States balance the use of prison as a crime deterrent and method of protection with the use of prison as a means of rehabilitation and renewal? And just adding on to that, to what extent are criminals worthy of our compassion, and how should we balance that with compassion for victims of their crime?
Well, coming back to the conversation we were having earlier about language, I myself try to avoid using words like criminal or words like inmate, because I think that it's one of the ways that we have been able to justify treating people like numbers in the system instead of treating people like human beings. So actually the state legislature just changed the law so that instead of the laws around incarceration using the word inmate, they now use the word incarcerated individual. That's kind of a mouthful, but I tend to say incarcerated person or incarcerated New Yorker, that sort of thing. And when talking about people who commit crimes, I say just that, people who commit crimes, because my time teaching in prison is really where incarcerated folks said to me, like, I'm tired of being called inmate 123. I'm tired of being called inmate. I want to be called Ms. Lang. I want to be called Lucy, whatever the question is. And so I think that addressing people based on their preferences is one kind of very small start towards thinking about incarcerated folks and people who go through the system as human beings. So that's sort of the premise that I start from. But the principle that I come back to in all of this is dignity, and that in the same way that you want your teachers, friends, parents to treat you with dignity, even when you're getting in trouble, that is basically what we want to treat everyone with. And that's true for people who are victimized as well. And I should say that I also, I did a lot of work with survivors of sexual violence, including victims of Harvey Weinstein's abuse. And that I found that it was very true for those folks as well, that they didn't want to be just called victims, that they would prefer to be thought of as whole people who had lives and careers and identities and families, and that their victimization is just one very traumatic part of their lives. But in fact, many victims prefer to be called survivors than to be called victims. So I try to be kind of thoughtful about how to use language in the criminal justice system, in part because not just because it matters for how people's experiences go, because you want to call people what they want to be called, but also because I think it helps kind of change the narrative for the public to talk about people as a survivor, which is much more empowering than a victim, or talk about someone as an incarcerated person instead of as an inmate. So that's just kind of one small way that I think we can move towards a system that looks more like the balance that's part of your question.
Alia has a question to follow up on that, but I want to check in with you, Lucy. Do you have another 10 minutes? Can we run until 2:20?
Sure. Yep. So
we're going to take our break a little bit later and get in a few more great questions here, starting with Alia.
Hi, I'm Alia. I'm a senior in a high school in New York. My question is, do prisons create more safety for the general citizen? What do we know about recidivism and what factors contribute to it?
Well, it depends on what we mean by create more safety, right? We've got to figure that, like, if we were all in a room together and one of you was over and over again stealing people's wallets, if we took that person out of the room and never let them in again, that they wouldn't steal your wallets anymore, right? But the reality is that 99% of people who go to prison now do come back to their communities. And so if we take that person out of the room and subject them to difficult conditions and don't give them any additional skills and then put them back in the room, are they any less likely to steal wallets than they were before they left? Probably not. So sure, there is just the fact of the kind of specific, it incapacitates people, right? And that's one rationale for removing people, that it incapacitates them during the period that they are incarcerated. But prisons are part of our communities as well. And unfortunately, there is also crime within prison. So if we take a more holistic view of crime and factor in the crime that occurs behind bars, then you think very differently about whether the incapacitation feature actually has any productive, or whether we are actually kind of accomplishing that particular goal. But moreover, because so folks are dehumanized when they're removed, and in cases where they are so rarely given additional skills or education, and you're released from prison basically with $40 at the edge of so you get out of we have 52 prisons across New York State, many of them far upstate. Most people who are incarcerated are from the city. You're released, near the Canada border with $40 and basically given told good luck. What are the odds that you're going to get back to your same community and be any less likely to commit crime than you were when you left? In fact, you're more likely to be more desperate than when you went away. So, and again, there's this question about how what we mean by the word recidivism. I think that most folks mean, does someone commit a crime and get caught up in the criminal justice system again? But I think what we should really be measuring is someone going on to have a dignified life, and is someone going on to be able to thrive when they return to their community. So I think we really need to recast the way we think about what success is, so that it's not just measuring recidivism based solely on system contact.
Great answer. Sabrina, coming to you.
Hi, Inspector General Lucy. My name is Sabrina. I'm a junior from Las Vegas. And now my question is, how much would legalizing marijuana on a federal level impact the criminal justice system? Do you think this would lead to substantial change?
Hi, Sabrina. We are in the process of essentially legalizing marijuana here in New York. And of course, a number of jurisdictions have done that already. And it's not clear exactly how this interplays with federal restrictions on marijuana. And I should add that it's kind of a myth that our prisons are full of people who've committed low-level marijuana offenses, and that is an antiquated sense of things. So I don't think that even legalization of marijuana is going to drastically reduce incarceration, but it's certainly in places where it is, where it's still locally illegal, it certainly results in people getting picked up by the police and touching the system. And, you know, when you cycle in and out of the system, even if you're not getting locked up for that long, but you get brought into custody, maybe you spend the night in central booking, then you get released, or maybe you do a couple days in local jail, you know, it's disruptive to people's lives. So even if it's not an egregious prison sentence, it still causes people to lose their jobs, miss days of school, general disruptions that undermine people's likelihood of being successful community members. So as a general matter, the move towards legalizing marijuana and appropriately regulating it is likely to decrease the amount of system contact that people have, which has the potential to be to the benefit.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Thank you. We're going to take Ashal and Amelie's questions together since they are complements to one another. So Ashal followed by Amelie, and then we'll have Lucy answer. Ashal, do we have you?
Yes, sorry, my Wi-Fi was being weird. But so what do you feel should be the highest priorities for criminal justice reform in New York?
And Amelie, you want to add on to that?
Yes, and what do you think are the biggest barriers to reform?
The biggest priority to my mind should be increasing public trust. That there really is a lack of public trust in the systems, both on the part of people who go through the system and communities who are over policed and have excessive contact with the criminal justice system, and on the part of community members who are not likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, who have this perception that crime has run rampant. So I think that there needs to be increased transparency to help bring the public along, to encourage them to be to believe in the criminal justice system, because really the system is only as good as the people who operate it and the communities that it operates in. And the only way that you can ever prove a crime is by victims who are willing to come forward and say what happened to them. And that can be a challenging experience in and of itself. So I would say that the priority needs to be sort of mending relationships with communities overall, especially communities who've experienced the vagaries of the criminal justice system. In terms of and I think that's particularly true in New York right now, where we are seeing a real amount of tension between reformers and more traditional kind of law and order folks. The obstacles are misinformation often, and I think a kind of alarmist approach to what's going on around us, that as devastating as any individual crime is, that we need to bear in mind that things are part of larger historical trends, and to react, to treat every case, with the dignity that it deserves, to make sure that survivors are heard, to make sure that people who touch the system are treated respectfully, but also to keep a kind of historical perspective and to focus on the areas where there can be real meaningful and long-term impact, rather than to be distracted by the cover of the New York Post on a day-to-day kind of basis.
Okay, we have 3 more questions, and I know we have limited time, but they're all so good that we're going to try to get through them and see if we can just truncate our break a little bit. We're going to come first to Jelena.
Okay, hi, I'm Jelena. I am a junior drama major at the Frank Sinatra School of the Arts. Sorry for the mask. Someone in my household has COVID right now. But my question is, why did you decide to pursue criminal justice reform from within the U.S. criminal justice system, opposed to outside of the system, such as through activism or different forms of civil disobedience? And do you think one is more effective than the other?
I have chosen to pursue change within the system because my reading of history is that that is a more effective way to get it done. I think about the fact that I measured all the prosecutor students who took my college and prison course I measured how punitive they were before they took the class and how punitive they were after. And it significantly decreased their likelihood to seek a punitive response, just spending a semester going to a college and prison class alongside incarcerated folks. Now, I never would have had the opportunity to do that if I didn't work inside the system. So that's why I made that choice. But I respect advocates and other approaches that people take to effectuating change. So it was my work inside the system that brought me to care about reform, because I saw people cycle through over and over again. And I thought that we should be thinking about ways to do things differently. And fortunately, because I worked in the system, I had the kind of credibility to be able to be a part of building an alternative to incarceration unit and to seek to actually make change from within. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't built up the kind of internal credibility to be able to try something new.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to come to Madeline for the last question.
Okay, so my name is Madeline, and I'm
sorry. Actually, Madeline, we're going to do Christina before we come to you for the last question.
Okay.
Christina.
Hi, sorry about that. I was just going to ask a little bit more about your work as New York Inspector General and, that new title, and what are your goals for that job? I know we spoke about it a little bit, but just specifically in this role.
So the Inspector General is a gubernatorial appointment, and I oversee an office that investigates all fraud, corruption, and waste in all the state executive agencies. And I would say that my overriding goal is kind of similar to what I suggested should be the goal of the criminal justice system in New York, which is to say, bringing back a sense of trust for the public in state government. I think that really across the state and across communities, people have lost faith in people who serve. And I'm in this wonderful position where I can be part of ensuring that folks who have complaints against elected officials and others who are using state resources to do various things are investigated when crimes occur, and that there is transparency about a reaction to those kinds of incidents. So my number one commitment really is to enhancing the public's trust in government, because I believe in government. I believe in the power of government to make positive change in people's lives. I believe that it's our civic institutions that bind us together and that we are stronger together, but we can't, we can't do any of it without the public's confidence. So I would say that that is kind of ground zero in the work that has to be done right now.
That may fit well with Madeline's last question. Madeline, bring us home.
Okay, so I'll introduce myself quickly. I am a junior, 16 years old, from Fort Hamilton High School in Brooklyn. And I was kind of interested in what we can do as youth who actually care about being civically involved, especially since criminal justice seems like an issue that can be out of our hands a little bit. So just what we can do at our ages now.
Educate yourselves about the issues, talk to your parents and community members, get involved locally, whether that is volunteering or serving on a community board or in another capacity, really as locally as your block association. And vote, of course, and think about a career in public service. It is an incredibly rewarding way to build a life. I can't recommend it strongly enough. But as you're making decisions about your coursework in high school and about where you'll go to college and what you want to pursue, consider building a life of service, because it is a great way to find meaning in your day-to-day and also to be connected with and a part of the people around you.
Lucy, We believe in the power of government and we believe in the power of you. Can we all give Lucy a big hand? Wish we could be together in person and have loved the opportunities when we have had you with the Civic Fellows, but really can't thank you enough for being here today with all that you're dealing with, and also for stepping up to the plate on behalf of our state and taking on this really crucial role and educating us more about it. I don't know if you are able to come back, at the end at around, 3:05 or so, that would be great. What we are going to do now, fellows, I ask if we can truncate our break a little bit because we're running a little bit late, to have a 7-minute break to be back here at 3:32. Please don't log off because you are in your deliberation groups, but take a minute, get a glass of water, stretch, get energized, and you're going to process these things in your deliberation groups at 2:32. See y'all soon. Back. Welcome back. Those were such rich conversations. We are not going to be able to do justice to all of them, but would love to hear just some highlights, and to have Lucy hear some of the highlights of things that came up, both around if you talked about your vision for moving beyond Rikers to borough-based jails, or if there was another question that you engaged with that you think was really rich. And we're going to do this. I will warm call if needed, but just if you would like to represent your group and to share some things with Lucy and your fellow fellows, the floor is open. This is a golden opportunity to share your thoughts with the Inspector General of the state of New York. No pressure, but great to sort of both share your thoughts, get some feedback from Lucy about, what do we do to improve the justice in our criminal justice system.
I'm counting on you all to solve all the problems. So,
I mean, Lucy's giving us some serious time this afternoon away from her family. We need a little quid pro quo here. So this is the give back section. Yes, Eloise. And you don't have to raise your hands, but we'll go Eloise and then we'll go Noelle.
Yeah, so I guess one sort of issue
to Lucy.
Sorry?
Eloise, will you introduce yourself to Lucy?
Oh, yeah. My name is Eloise Gordon. I'm in 10th grade and I live in Manhattan. One issue that was brought up a lot in our group was just the idea of closing Rikers, which is I know is a very big one that's been addressed a lot over the years, and even just the idea started back in 2017. But just the question of, are the deep generational, criminal or justice issues facing our society, like, can they be solved in time to make it so that we don't have to close Rikers? And I think the reality is, the conclusion we came to is that there are so many, factors that have brought Rikers to what it is to this day, and psychological impacts that Rikers has had on our state and our city, that just can't be addressed fast enough, and that ultimately, from with the knowledge that we have, the smartest decision might even look like closing it, which is already in the book. So that's something that we discuss.
Well, it really sounds like you all are having conversations about exactly what the right issues are in evaluating the question about closing Rikers. This has been a problem that's plagued the city for a long time, and it is certainly at a fever pitch right now. Again, I think it's instructive to bear in mind this notion that we are in between paradigms, that we are stuck with an infrastructure that's built for one purpose, and we're looking for a system that accomplishes an entirely different purpose. So the unwinding of the existing infrastructure in order to be able to build a new one, sort of, people talk about, flying the building a plane while you fly it, is almost a seemingly insurmountable challenge. And one of the key ways that I see it working is by decreasing the number of people who are detained overall. So building alternatives, including community service, educational alternatives, job training, those sorts of things is going to be really critical as we move towards a future without Rikers, or at the very least with a drastically changed Rikers. I mean, one of the problems is that it's such a, the structure there, the facilities at Rikers are so poor. And because there's been such a movement towards getting rid of it for a long time, there has been really no investment in the facilities, which exacerbates the fact that it's that it was already a hellhole, and now it's kind of all the more so because it's also falling apart. So, no, it's politically untenable to invest in Rikers right now. But my hope is that by investing in alternatives that will help shrink the reliance on Rikers, that will enable the city to move closer towards a future that doesn't subject people to the conditions that they're currently subjected to in Rikers.
And we might come back to you, Lucy, to ask about, the tensions already playing out between our incoming DA, who is not you, but the next best alternative, and the incoming police sergeant. But first, we're going to go to Noelle.
Hi, I'm Noelle Hardy. I'm a freshman in high school from California. And my group really focused on envisioning the future of borough-based jails if we were going to not rely so much on Rikers. And we came up with a couple solutions. One was bringing in more people who are trained in social working to bring counseling in, as well as some addiction recovery programs, such as like Alcoholics Anonymous, to rehabilitate these people to be more productive in society. And something that I was just thinking about in terms of reform is something that's been happening is a lot of judges, it was a common practice when you appoint judges to take them from prosecutors, but more and more public defenders have gotten the opportunity to serve as judges, which is a new development that we're seeing in criminal justice reform, which I think could be helpful.
As the founder of the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution, I think Lucy may have some thoughts about that.
I do. I think people forget that prosecutors and defense attorneys are not intended to be sort of equally situated, that defense attorneys represent one person, the person who's accused of a crime, and prosecutors represent the public, which includes the person who's been victimized and the person who is accused of a crime and the community at large. So it's a much broader mandate. So there are ways in which public defenders on the bench are, it's important to have a mix of people from all kinds of backgrounds, as I see it, as judges, but it is not necessarily the case that just because someone has been a prosecutor that they're more likely to be unduly punitive as a judge. In fact, they're more likely to have kind of experience taking the needs and concerns of a broader public into consideration in their work on the bench, as that's part of the kind of mandate of a prosecutor. Borough-based jails, they've met with an incredible amount of tension because people have this sort of NIMBY approach to jails, and part of it is that jails are so rotten right now, and so people don't want them in their neighborhood. And you can imagine a framework in which people, if they were more pleasant places to be, that people might not mind having them closer to their homes. But we're not there yet. So I'll be very curious to see how the borough-based jails conversation plays out over the course of the next administration.
Well said. It is certainly going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Again, those are supposed to phase in by 2027. So Dashiell, yes, and then we'll come to Julia.
Yeah, my group, so I was in Eloise's group, so she covered a lot of the content that we discussed. But so the general consensus that we came to in our group was that in general, Rikers, it's really not a tenable solution. because it's costing a ton of money and it's not working as you want it to. It's incredibly overcrowded too. So our initial solution was, okay, well, we can look into more localized jails so that Rikers is not the only the only existing offering. So we thought about that originally. And then there was still this question of, if the business model of a prison is to make money, would more localized jails help? Because generally a prison makes money by keeping inmates in that prison for an extended period of time. So if you increase the quantity of prisons, wouldn't that same problem kind of reverberate, even though there is more offerings? And we also agreed that although there isn't that kind of mental turmoil of saying, okay, you're an inmate at Rikers Island or something like that, because that is like a notorious prison. It's more well-known than many other prisons, basically all other prisons. So we agreed on that, and that it could help in that sense. And then we also were kind of talking about, okay, well, maybe a better solution would be if we redirected the funds in prisons to efforts to stop people from even needing to go into the prison in the first place. And how we would do this is like you target communities that are disproportionately committing crimes historically, and then you could send the funds to certain programs in those types of communities. And this would all be with the intention of reducing the possible crime rates that those communities can produce. So do you think that that's a plausible alternative to Rikers? Because in the meantime, localized jails may not be the best solution, and we can't, within a reasonable time span, overturn the entire prison system. So we need basically a coexisting of probably two systems. So do you think that that's, I guess, reasonable?
Well, the economic implications of prisons are a critical part of the analysis about what we're going to do going forward. But sometimes I think that the emphasis that's placed on private prisons is a bit misplaced. We don't have private prisons here in New York State, and the majority of prisons across the country are not private prisons. They are funded by government dollars. And the purpose of them is not to make money. The purpose is ostensibly here in New York, it's the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. So the idea is to correct people. The model that we have clearly is not successfully doing that. But so there's not an agreement on what the purpose of prisons is, but it's certainly not and shouldn't be, in my view, to make money. However, there are a lot of really complex economic questions that are brought to bear as part of this. And that is in part, because government can't operate alone. And so most prisons have private partnerships with individual vendors. And just to give you an example, I'm not sure if Sanda distributed information about my recent breaking news in advance of our session, but my office just concluded a multi-year investigation into a contract that the Department of Corrections had with a private vendor called Microgenics, which was a drug testing operation that provided drug tests. And the Department of Corrections bought these drug tests and were using them to test people who were incarcerated for whether or not they were using behind bars, and then penalizing them when people were found to have what's known as dirty urine. It turned out that they were both that the tests themselves were not very well calibrated. They were too sensitive. And so they would give positives where people had, for example, artificial sweeteners were coming back with positive drug test results. And the Department of Corrections was misusing the test in that they weren't validating them by doing a second confirmatory test. So this happened and thousands of New Yorkers ended up being penalized for having dirty urine when in fact they hadn't used drugs at all. So my office investigated Microgenics in the Department of Corrections. And in that case, it was kind of a cost-cutting measure. You know, the prison contracted with the cheapest vendor to secure these drug tests. And it ended up really harming a whole lot of New Yorkers because these folks were being sent to solitary confinement or having their parole hearings delayed or getting denied their rights to visit with their family, that sort of thing. And obviously that is incredibly troubling, but was the result of the fact that there are limited kind of public dollars to get things done. And so that can result in cost cutting. So I would encourage folks to focus more on the question about how we can reform prison conditions in public prisons and increase alternatives to incarceration instead of focusing the bulk of energy on the problem of private prisons in particular. And there's a wonderful nonprofit called Worth Rises that has done a lot of work on issues related to the economics of prisons here in New York. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in that issue to check out some of the work of Worth Rises.
I just have a quick follow-up question. I promise that this will be quick. But
Okay,
I mean,
Dasha, we are really tight. It's got to be really tight because we have to go to Julia.
Okay. Can I go quickly?
Yeah.
Please. But I just like researched this real quick. So in the year 2000, there was like 87,000 private prisons. That's a pretty substantial amount of prisons. And this was just in the USA alone. So I think it's kind of misleading to say that that's not a substantial problem, especially if we haven't entirely figured out the policy about that. I think that, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be focusing the bulk of our efforts on it. But still, I think that it's still a pretty big problem.
Point well taken. Absolutely.
Thank you for that clarification. Julia. And again, we are running low on time, so this may be one of our last statements. So feel free, as Malcolm just demonstrated, to put some things in the chat. Julia.
Yeah, so something that we were talking about, and I'll try to keep this quick, was replacing Rikers with borough-based prisons. And one of the reasons we know is to make the prisons more humane. But something that we're talking about is if one of the planned prisons would be in Lower Manhattan, and that's a very urban area, and we kind of assumed it would have to be almost like an apartment building. So if you had a prison that was almost like an apartment building where maybe you could only get outside on the roof and you would be able to see people in very urban Lower Manhattan just kind of going about their lives through the windows all the time, like would that be conducive to good mental health? And yeah, what is the, I guess, reasoning behind that in terms of? Yeah.
There are a number of prisons already in the city, and there are a lot of urban prisons, but in fact, the borough-based jail in Manhattan is slated to be at the site of what's currently the Tombs, which is the prison that's attached to the jail that's attached to the courthouse. So it's already there. The idea is to build it up a bunch of stories beyond that. And right now, I'm not actually sure what the outside access of that prison is. Sorry, that's my 6-year-old again. But the prison across the street at around 500 Pearl Street, which is the Metropolitan Detention Center, which is a federal prison, the yard is on the roof. And you can actually see from the top of the adjacent federal courthouse, you can see people playing basketball in the yard, that sort of thing. And I taught in a prison that recently closed, which is on Central Park North, called Lincoln Correctional Facility, where the yard was upstairs and people would look out over Central Park. And so there are, pluses and minuses. Obviously, fresh air and a view is a good thing, but it can be incredibly demoralizing to look out at the city and see people experiencing freedom when you're locked up behind bars. And so the mental health concerns are absolutely real and concerning. And in some ways, I think the mental health challenges of living in a city that can happen for people who are at liberty are just, incredibly heightened when people are incarcerated in an urban setting. So you're absolutely right to be concerned with and thinking about those issues. And I think it's one of the many challenges that the designers of the borough-based prison in Manhattan are going to face when that starts to come to fruition. And in fact, I think that the plans are probably available online, so you can take a look at what they have planned for outdoor space.
We will circulate those. And I will also say, we just experienced a master class in leadership as Lucy kept her equanimity and focus and gave such an insightful and astute response. with her 6-year-old crying in the background, and another child also there. So we're going to let you go now at this point, Lucy. We could talk to you for hours and days and weeks and months, and we hope that we will have the opportunity. Lucy is a dear friend of the Civic Fellowship and mentor, and actually it's a bridge to us talking about our civic action projects because Lucy has sponsored many great civic action projects that we will tell you about, but we're going to let Lucy hop off with, again, great gratitude, and we will follow up with you, Lucy. And we will follow up as Lucy said, we'll share the plans. But just we want to give you just for a second, if you want to, any last things you want to say to us, Lucy, in terms of call to action or?
Oh, I'm so proud of the work that you all are doing and of your thoughtful questions. And I'm excited for the work that you have ahead of you. I wanted to address Malcolm's thoughts in the chat and say that I am all for a model where mental health professionals and other non-law enforcement respond in to emergency situations where there's not a law enforcement need. And I'm hopeful that we will see some experimentation with those kinds of models in the future here in the city. So keep up the great work, everybody. You're incredible. You're lucky to be part of this wonderful network. And I will look forward to being in person with you soon. And I apologize for the chaos around me, but you'll find such is life as a professional, especially during COVID and during on a snowy city. Yeah. Take good care, everyone.
Thank you for taking the time with us today, Lucy. So as we were alluding to, so this officially marks, if you can believe it, the end of our first semester and of our civic forums. It has been a whirlwind ride through some of the most complex civic issues of our times. And the way that the Civic Fellowship is set up is that the first semester is sort of one-on-one. You get some exposure to some of the issues. We started with affordable housing during our civic orientation, freedom of expression, environmental justice and climate change and divestment, structural racism, critical race theory, today criminal justice. The second semester, if you choose to participate, it's your choice. We hope that you will continue on, is an opportunity to do a deeper dive into one of those issues or a few other issues that we didn't get to in the first semester. And what that means is instead of having a speaker with us and instead of like rotating in groups, you'll choose one. I will circulate the Google form where you can sign up and you will be connected to a consistent group of fellows who you will work with for the next 3 months. And you will architect a project that you will do that will enable you to really be immersed and sort of, so if we thought of first semester as 101, this is a 202 to do more complex work that is modeled off of college work. And with that, the best way to understand civic action projects is to hear a little bit about them. And we have some folks who have done one of whom I want to introduce because you may have seen someone with us today. So Alia has joined the Civic Fellowship in her sophomore year. She is now a first-year student at Carleton College. She was a lead Civic Fellow for 2 years and a summer, and has just been instrumental in everything that Next Gen Politics has done. So she's had the opportunity to do 2 different civic action projects, and will tell us a little bit about that. And then I encourage any other lead fellows to pop in and share a little bit about your civic action projects. I'm going to put the link, it's in your agenda. I'm also going to put it in. I know we're running a couple minutes late, but hope you can stay to hear a little bit about these civic action projects. Talia.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. So I think a great part of more recently the Next Gen program has been these civic action projects, because the first year I was involved, we didn't have this aspect. We just continued speakers, which of course was really interesting. But I think such a large part of Next Gen is bringing it back to your community. And this was such an active role that you could play. So my first year, which was 2 years ago, involved through the Civic Action Project, I focused on voter registration. So we had voter registration weeks in our high school. And it also happened to be the week that we all got sent home because of COVID in March. So that kind of was an interesting overlap. But then there's also an interesting way to see the transition to virtual. And since we continued to meet virtually, we also kind of took on COVID as another aspect of the voter registration project. And we thought about the way in which our system wasn't equipped to register people in times like this. And also just the way that in such a technologically advanced society, we should have systems in place that allow for people who are maybe don't have the ability to go out and take time out of their day to like figure out all these complicated forms, like we have websites in place that should be able to do these simple tasks. And so I worked with Bree from from the Brennan Center, and she was amazing. I don't know if she came this year, but I still like.
No, but she is sponsoring a project. This is Brianna Tia, who heads Generation Vote and is with the Brennan Center for Justice.
Yeah, it was amazing, and like I still think about voter registration like all the time, which I know is kind of silly, but like even here, like coming from New York to Minnesota, it's like, okay, where is my vote going to matter most, and how do I get around this? And it was more complicated than I would have liked it to be to change my registration, but it was something that like, because of this program, was really on the forefront of my mind. And then the next year, I'm like blanking.
Your freedom of expression survey.
Oh yes, okay, freedom of expression. Also back in high school, Sanda and FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions.
Will Creeley did join us this fall, so that was the session right after our civic orientation.
Yeah, so we worked on creating a forum to kind of see like the situation with freedom of expression and the comfort within different high schools. So that was really easily translated and kind of like worked into the tenets of Next Gen, because like we all come from different places. And so obviously the experiences with freedom of expression were going to be so different. And so we were able to collect data and eventually present it at the end of our CAP. And actually another interesting aspect is like, this summer when I'm looking for like summer internships, politically related, one with FIRE popped up. So it's like, I already had associated with them prior. So it's just like all these different aspects of Next Gen, like they stay with you, even if you're not there every single meeting. And it's just been like such a big part of my college experience already, like getting involved in political organizations and like in classes, sometimes we'll be talking about something and like, I'm able to reference a piece of information I found out from a Next Gen forum. And it's just been really awesome to have that.
Thank you for that, Talia. And, as noted, Talia has been involved since the earliest days and so formative to the program. Also wanted to mention that Madeline and Malcolm were both part of that Freedom of Expression project. And the two of them and a few others actually are going to be published authors around this Freedom of Expression survey. They have an article that will be coming out in the next month in Education Week about essays that they wrote about their findings in the survey. So, again, all of this is applied work that has impact in the world. Christina, can we come to you? So we've just met with Lucy, and we heard a little bit about one of the many things that Lucy has started, the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. If you want to tell us a little bit about your CAP last spring.
Yeah, I also did, well, actually not also, I did a CAP project on criminal justice. I think there were multiple last year, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Yes, 3 different ones.
Yeah, and we focused particularly on, and we kind of merged actually 2 of the different interests, but we focused mainly on informing people on how to vote and specific policies of like local, very, officials that are very like considered small election officials, and, having people understand what those platforms were for those officials, because oftentimes those are the people that impact the criminal justice system the most. It usually isn't like the president who's, deciding what sentence, a certain person will get. It's usually these people in these positions that a lot of the time people are not aware of just because they are smaller positions. So we focused on making a website, and I believe one of the members actually made it into a real website, which is super exciting. But we made a website that, like in an ideal world, like you would put in your zip code and it would like pop out like when your next election is and who is running in that election. It has like certain criminal justice platforms, and just informing people of we specified we mainly focused on prosecutors in this project just because prosecutors have such a crucial role, but it was an overview of all municipal governments. So that's a really brief overview.
Thank you, Christina. And so in that, one thing just to bring out is that these projects are sort of like co-created by a group of fellows, and an organizational partner like a Will Creeley from Fire, Michelle Mason from Institute for Innovation and Prosecution. And so it's something that will have a life beyond just your project and be an opportunity to apply. You know we are over. Feel free to dismiss yourself if you need to go. If anyone else wants to share from your Civic Action Project in the past, or if you want to ask any questions about the Civic Action Project, if you are new to the fellowship this year, the floor is open, and you can also put it in the chat.
I can also share my CAP that I did last year.
That'd be great.
I also focused on criminal justice, but I worked with Jarrell Daniels, and he was formerly incarcerated himself, and we pretty much focused on preventing people from going to jail, and we made a list of resources that they're like, some were like educational opportunities, and some were places to get clothes and stuff, and we made a list for them. But it was really interesting, and it opened my eyes because I was talking to someone who actually like went through that.
Thank you so much. And it's a great thing that Ashal raised, right? It's also sort of like just that experience with people who are directly doing the work, affected by the work, to really see how it plays out beyond a single session. Anyone else want to share from your CAP last year, or any questions you have about the prospect of a Civic Action Project or CAP?
I can share mine really quick. My CAP project was a voting initiative. We worked primarily on lowering the voting age, as well as working with YVO on that as well. And that was super interesting to go through sort of like the legal elements of how that would work and talking about it as a group.
And building on what Caitlin said, and maybe if Sharona wants to jump in, we actually did a national lower the voting age event with a partner out in Oregon to bring more attention to this.
Yeah, I guess really briefly, we were also working with Brianna Sia from, I think it's GenVote, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, GenVote. And yeah, I was actually one of the representatives on the panel. And it was really interesting to see how like voting initiatives within Oregon, how they differed from our initiatives within New York, and just like getting that like national perspective was really interesting as well.
They also did a social media takeover, and there were a bunch of components of their campaign. Any other thoughts or questions anyone wants to share? Okay, well, if they arise, feel free to pop an email or a text. Please do fill this out by next Monday, so January 17th, which I've also heard, I heard data that statistically January 17th is the most depressing day of the year. Just in any given year, January 17th is. I don't know why. I don't know how the scientists came up with this. Something about the weather, the distance from the holidays, or something. But to lift you up that day when you might otherwise be depressed, make sure that you have submitted your Civic Action Form. We will definitely try to accommodate your first preferences. We ask you for your top 3. We may reach out to follow up with you. And then our first session of our CAPS will be on, I believe it's Sunday, February 5th. I always mix up these dates, but I'm pretty sure, or is that the 6th? The Sunday that is either the 5th or the 6th, which my thing is not showing me. I think it's the 6th. February 6th. Thank you all for an incredible first semester. I just got a text from Lucy saying how impressed she was by all of you. So you should feel great, when the Inspector General of the state of New York is impressed by you. Thank you all so, so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy 2020. I don't even think we said that. Here's to a powerful and peaceful 2020. Thanks all. Look forward to all that lies ahead.